the sooner it's submitted, the sooner I can get started grading them. And I do want to get those graded and go through the revision process as needed before obviously the end of the grading period. So, so if there's no other questions with that, what we're going to do is we are going to be transitioning to actually talking about a standard that we cover in terms of the actual presidencies. So we don't go through the list verbatim every single president. It would be nice to do that. I mean, some of you may disagree and say no, but it would be nice to do that, but we're not going to be able to. But one of the things that we do cover extensively has a lot to do with it, is the first 5 presidencies. So you're talking about George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. The big reason those 5 are grouped together is that all 5 of them played major roles during the Revolutionary period. And when James Monroe's presidency concludes in 1824, or 1825 is when the new president would be inaugurated. That's the end of an era. Okay, and so the president that will follow him is actually the son of John Adams. So it's a whole new era in politics. And so that early period, which we call the Federalist period, is what we're going to focus on first. So here's our standard that we look at. And basically, we're going to look at the significant events that lead to the pivotal election of 1800, which is when, for the first time, we have transfer of power from one political party to another. So how does it get to the point where, first of all, we have political parties? Because these are not concepts that we have when George Washington or John Adams are thinking about the presidency, or even when the Congress or the founding fathers are thinking about the role of what this executive is going to be. We don't have in place political parties. That's one thing that is unique in this process, is that we don't have political parties that are actually deciding who's of which party and who's of which political beliefs. We don't have them in place. Okay, but we get to the point when that happens, and the 2 guys that are responsible for that are Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, as I'm sure many of you know. The big thing is that we need to understand, what does Washington's presidency look like? What does John Adams's presidency look like? And why those 2 elections lead us to a transfer of power in 1800, okay? Now, when we are thinking about ultimately what is going to be the ideal executive, we got to think back to the fact that there's some precaution that has to be considered when we are choosing what we want this presidency to look like. Because remember, at first, we don't have a president. We don't have an executive under the first government, under the Articles of Confederation. There was no executive branch. It was only a legislative branch. And we saw the major flaws of that because we had no ability to enforce laws. So with this circumstance, the fact that the new government is created with 3 branches, one of them being an executive, those who are defending the policies, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, argue what needs to be in terms of qualifications and characteristics of this executive. And Alexander Hamilton, I think, put it really well in Federalist Paper number 7. Excuse me. He says, quote, "The ingredients which constitute energy in the executive are, first, unity; secondly, duration; thirdly, an adequate provision for its support; and fourthly, competent powers." Okay. And one of the things that Hamilton says is necessary is that whoever this first president's going to be has to be an energetic figure to bring their ability and their energy to the role of the president in a leadership capacity. Okay. It's not supposed to be a circumstance where the executive is supposed to be seen as greater in terms of power than the other branches, but they have to be someone who is actively taking a role in the government. Most historians point to the fact that the executive branch was always supposed to be slightly lower in terms of authority and influence than the legislative branch. I mean, one could argue that the legislative branch is the most powerful of the three branches in terms of their responsibilities and their roles. Now that has obviously changed a little bit over time, and especially early on, because we don't know what this presidency role is supposed to be like, because we don't have a guide to go by. I mean, let's face it, the only examples that we have of direct leadership is a king and a monarch. And we obviously don't want our executive, which is an individual person that holds power, to mirror anything like a king, because then what was the whole point of the revolution? Okay. So when we think about the ideal person that people are envisioning to be this inaugural president, this brand new role of this president, there's very few names that are thrown out, and it really all comes down to one person, and that's George Washington. And the reason why is because, quite frankly, he was the best choice. Now, you could argue that George Washington does not have the political experience or even the political interest in the role, but he is tremendously popular. He's tremendously trustworthy. He's a leader, and he's honest. Okay, and he's revered by the people. And if you look throughout history, you've seen countless other examples where we've had war heroes that have been presidents. Okay, we've had Dwight Eisenhower, we've had James Garfield, Ulysses S. Grant, Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor, William Henry Harrison. War heroes are ideal candidates for president. Okay, and so really with Washington, it just came down to, does he have an interest in the job? There was absolutely going to be some reluctance by Washington because, one, he doesn't know what his role is as president. Two, he doesn't know if he fully wants the job. I mean, this is someone who has been pulled out of retirement for public service time and time again. Okay, if you think about it, he was the general during the Continental Army during the war, goes into retirement. He's pulled out of retirement after the crisis surrounding the Articles of Confederation, and he's made president of the Constitutional Convention. He goes back to retirement. And now, once again, basically the people and his friends and colleagues and other leaders in the country are saying, we need you. There is nobody else that can handle this role, especially the role the very first time, than you. So he reluctantly agrees to run for president. And I'll just tell you right then, when people know that George Washington's running for president, it's over. The election's over. You're not going to defeat George Washington, okay? So I start with this letter, and I do this every year because I think it's an interesting way to look at it in terms of perspective about the importance of this role. And the document itself is unique because it has a connection to us here in Bloomington. So it's dated April 14th, 1789, signed by Washington, and it says, I had the honor to receive your official communication by the hand of Mr. Secretary Thompson about 1 o'clock this day. Having concluded to obey the important and flattering call of my country, him being elected, and having been impressed with an idea of the expediency of my being with Congress at as early a period as possible, I propose to commence my journey on Thursday morning, which will be the day after tomorrow. So this is the acceptance letter that Washington writes for the presidency. Now, the date seems later than normal, but the inauguration originally was in April. It was only moved back in the last century to January, and that was through an amendment to the Constitution. Okay, so that's important to remember here. The cool thing about this letter is that we're talking about the first president ever to accept the presidency, is that this resides at the Lilly Library on IU's campus. So this is something that is housed at the Lilly Library. It was originally bought by Eli Lilly, the namesake of the library who donated all his papers and books there. And so something like this of this importance you would think would be in the Smithsonian, but it's in fact here in Bloomington, which I think is kind of cool. So, all right, let's talk about this first presidency, okay? First of all, this election is going to be different than every other election we have in American history for numerous reasons. It's a new process by which we're allowing states to be in charge of their own election process. That's in the Constitution. It's still the case today. It's been there from the very beginning. Each state operates their election process different. And the reason why this election is technically ending in an odd year is because this election actually began in late 1788 and did not end until early 1789. It's the only time that we really see this because it took so long for the election process in the states to conclude. And we don't have a national election day at this time. We don't have a designated day that states have to have, it's not on the first Tuesday of November. So in some cases, states were still gathering their election results into early 1789. And this is the only time we're going to see this. Verl, did you have a question?
Did it let me unmute?
Yeah, you're unmuted.
Okay. If Washington was like already just going to win by so much, why did it take so long to figure out who won?
It was more or less, that's a good question. It was more or less the process of counting the votes and getting the official tallies into the Electoral College. And the reason is because counties in each individual states had the elections all across the board. And like I said, it took several, the states and the counties within the states could choose when their election process would begin and end, as long as it ended by a certain date in early 1789. So the Electoral College could actually, convene and vote officially. Okay, so over time, things are going to be tightened up because obviously, people want to know the results. But this is a very primitive election, very little technology involved, word of mouth, and written in newspapers. So in some cases, it could be several days, if not weeks, for some people in rural areas to know the results of the election. Okay. One thing you need to understand about this election is that if you were an elector officially casting the vote to choose the presidency, you had 2 votes. Okay, because we don't, since we don't have political parties at this time, you're putting together as a pack. You don't have a package deal of I'm running for president and here's my running mate. It is, if you're in first place, you get to be the president. If you're in second place, you get to be the vice president. Now, again, this is before political parties. But if you take this process and apply it to current time, it's a disastrous situation. So if you think about 2016, you would have Donald Trump as president and Hillary Clinton as the vice president if you went under this old original system. Now, they're going to fix this by 1804 with the 12th Amendment, but originally they didn't see it as an issue. Okay. Now, there was some rules that your president and vice president couldn't be from the same state. There was just a lot of confusion here. One of the big things that was early on with the Electoral College is that they were concerned that voters who were eligible, white, male, landowners over the age of 21, would still not be informative enough to know the candidates everywhere. They would know regional candidates and they would know someone like Washington, but in some cases, the president and vice presidential candidates wouldn't be known across the country. Sinead?
What prompted the amendment to the Constitution that changed the person in second place to becoming the vice president? Was it like a specific election in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's going to be the election of 1796, where John Adams, as a Federalist, is elected president, and Thomas Jefferson, as a Democratic Republican, is elected vice president. Therefore, you having, for the one and only time, a president and a vice president of 2 political parties, different parties. And you can obviously see why that would be a major problem, because clearly everything that Adams wants to do is going to be opposed by Jefferson because of their political differences. So it's a great question. So if we look at the political map here, first of all, it's a much more constrained country because we only have 13 states. It is interesting to note that the borders for a lot of these states, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, stretch all the way to the Mississippi River. Those were land claims originally by states so that those who moved west would be able to access the Mississippi River and go to New Orleans for trade. Because the idea is that we don't want to be constrained only east of the Mississippi River. We want to expand out, the population's growing, but the further away you are from the coast, the harder it is for you to take your goods to market to sell, okay? And given the fact that this land out here is no longer restricted under that proclamation law from the Revolution, you have people pushing west. You have people pushing west in the territories and to these areas because it's only going to be a couple of years before Kentucky and Tennessee become the 14th and 15th states. So that's why the borders look very different. And obviously, if you live in the territories, you don't get to vote. So if you're living in the Indiana territory, you didn't get to vote, just like if you live in a U.S. territory like Guam or Puerto Rico, you don't get to vote today. All right. So if you look at the map, one thing to remember is that we don't have political parties. So none of the candidates are identifying as themselves as a part of a party. Now, historically looking back, some historians label candidates as members of certain parties based on their beliefs and their actions and the decisions that they made. So like, for example, George Washington, who never identified himself as being a political party and actually despised them and warns the people about political parties when he leaves, is labeled as a Federalist later in history because he tended to side much more with Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, than he did with Thomas Jefferson when it came to decisions. It's part of the reason why Jefferson left his role as Secretary of State, because he got so fed up with Washington seemingly always taking Hamilton's side on so many topics and issues. Okay. So one thing to remember about this time that makes it so much different than we can imagine today is that campaigning was essentially non-existent. George Washington never gives a speech. He never writes an article or makes a statement. He's at Mount Vernon during the entire duration of the period leading up to the election. He never has to do that because he's going to win based on name recognition alone and his accolades before he runs for president. I mean, you're talking about the leader of the army that wins independence against Britain. There's nothing else you can do that makes you more qualified to be president in the eyes of the people. Okay. So, and here's the other thing you need to understand. It was customary for candidates running for president to not campaign. It was more or less an unwritten rule, and it was a custom that you were not campaigning actively yourself on behalf of your campaign to run for president. It was just something that didn't happen. And that's well into the 19th century, that you have your political party and your supporters do that for you, and you're not doing very little, you're not doing any campaigning at all. Okay. Now, if you look at the map here, you see Washington is the only name listed there. All right. You see this, you see the territories, and you see these states in black, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I'll just tell you right now, Washington wins every electoral vote. It shouldn't be surprising, but I'll tell you, he wins it twice because Washington is reluctantly, I really mean it this time, reluctantly going to choose to run for a second term. Okay. He was ready to leave after 4 years, and basically Hamilton convinced him that they needed stability. 4 years was not enough to stabilize the country under this new government, and he stayed for 4 more years. Okay. And the poor guy actually dies a little over 2 years after his time in office is up. So he was very much a lifelong public servant. But going back to the map here, okay, 3 states didn't have electoral votes in this election. And here's why. New York was kind of not getting their stuff together and had not formally chosen electors by the deadline that was needed, and therefore didn't have eligibility to vote in the Electoral College because there was a dispute over who the electors are going to be. And each state, still to this day, decides who the electors are going to be for each party. Now, North Carolina and Rhode Island at this time had yet to ratify the Constitution, so they were ineligible to vote in this first election. They will get that fixed, obviously, by the next election in 1792, but only 10 of the 13 states had electoral votes cast in this election. So it's kind of a unique one in that process. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, everybody had 2 ballots. The first ballot was for president. The second ballot was for vice president. The vice presidential voting was a little bit tighter, but ultimately John Adams, a very public, well-known figure from the Revolution, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a longtime representative from Massachusetts, was chosen as his vice president. Now, it's interesting because historians debate whether or not Washington would have chosen Adams as a running mate had he had that ability under the current system that we use today, where someone says, I'm running for president, and then the party officially nominates this candidate as their running mate. Because even though Washington and Adams were friendly, Adams is largely alienated during Washington's presidency. He's not, I would say, a part of the inner circle that Washington has with the other members of his cabinet. And if you're curious who his cabinet is, well, it's a pretty impressive cabinet. And I know you obviously know these names. And there's also Edmund Randolph, who's the Attorney General of the United States, which was not at that time an official cabinet position. And then you have Henry Knox, who worked under Washington during the war. But it really comes down to, and I think we all know this, it comes down to these two guys, Jefferson and Hamilton. Okay. I think there have not been two more influential cabinet members in history than these two, because they are going to shape the early stages of the American country's, ascent to trying to be a legitimate country, but they're also going to cause the birth of political parties. There's no way around it. The reason why we have political parties today is because Hamilton and Jefferson created them. Whether or not they liked them or not, there's some debate about that and about whether they actually despise them. They're responsible for it. Cassidy?
Jefferson and Hamilton have historically not gone along. How did they get anything done during Washington's presidency?
Ultimately, what Washington does, and if you read about Washington's role as president, it's something that he did as a general, is he had what was called counsel. And basically, he would listen to the opinions of the advisors. And granted, quite frankly, Jefferson and Hamilton would not come to agreements on very few things. But ultimately, despite Jefferson's opposition to that, George Washington was going to side much more with Hamilton. Now, there was compromising that did take place, and it's something we'll talk about later as to why the capital of the United States, which at that time was New York, was moved to Washington, D.C. It's largely due to a compromise that had to be reached between Jefferson and Hamilton over a proposal about the economy that Hamilton wanted done. And Jefferson was adamantly opposed to it, but both men knew that if they didn't compromise, nothing was going to get done. You have to remember this, and this is critical. We are a very, very, very young nation. When Washington takes the presidency officially in 1789, we're only 6 years removed from the revolution being over. We're only 6 years removed from Britain recognizing us as a separate sovereign nation. We have a lot of work to do if we're going to be taken seriously by other countries around the world and not just considered to be a laughingstock or a country that inevitably will become a colony of a monarchy again, which a lot of countries felt we had no chance of making this democratic process work, that we were doomed because it was proven with all the monarchies in the world that a democratic republic would not work. We saw it fail in Greece. We saw it fail in Rome. It wasn't going to work here. So we had to establish for ourselves that we were a legitimate nation. And part of that had to do with handling our finances, the money that we owed, because that's the biggest thing we're going to face as a country, is that we owe $80 million to a variety of nations, including Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, especially, who basically bankrolled our entire war. If we can't prove to those countries that we can pay back a debt and take care of business, then we're doomed to fail. And that's part of the reason why Washington's presidency was stressful, because during that, you saw these two men at odds with each other, constantly bickering and constantly becoming more divided. And it's one of, it's one of the big issues that Washington highlights in his farewell address, is that he's so worried about the future of the country and political parties. He's so worried that the nation is going to become so divided that it can't get anything done. And it's amazing because if you look at, and we'll talk about this, if you look at the first two elections in history, 1789 and 1792, they look very united. But if you look at 1796, boom, total change. Geographically, it's night and day, because Washington's gone, parties are in place, and we're divided. It takes 3 elections to do it. Okay. All right. There is an exit ticket for today. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot stress this enough, and I need everybody to tune in for this. Exit tickets are an indicator of your attendance, okay? Even if you're in with me on the live meeting, you still have to complete the exit tickets, and a lot of people are not doing that. And some of those exit tickets I'm really paying attention to, and that's a good indicator for me of your attendance. And if I do not have verification of your attendance, you're marked absent in Skyward. Okay. And I already have gone back and done that for Monday with the exit ticket about your progress on your speech, as I mentioned Monday and on Tuesday. Okay. The exit ticket for today is for you to discuss 2 main points of what you learned about Washington's presidency and the early presidency in complete sentences. Okay. So that's what I have for today. Remember, tomorrow is the iPad exchange from 5 to 8 p.m. here at school. You need to make sure you contact Mrs. Whitaker at the library if that's not going to be possible. I will tell you folks, these iPads, the new ones, are really nice. They have keyboards built in, so you're not going to want to miss out on them. I'm just telling you that. Okay, I will see you tomorrow. We're going to talk more about the issues facing the country when Washington takes over and how he's going to handle that. So I will see you then.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank
Of course. Yep.